So, I introduce you to Francesco Mazzucchelli. He has earned his PhD in semiotics from the University of Bologna in 2009 with the dissertation, The Memory of the City, Strategies and Processes of Self-Representation in the Post-War Urban Transformations of Some Cities of Former Yugoslavia. Since 2010, he is a researcher at the Communication Studies Department of the Bologna University. In 2011, he was visiting research fellow at the Manchester Architecture Research Centre. His researches concern the relationship between memory and urban space, and his interests cover a number of fields of study such as ethnosemiotics, memory studies, Balkan and urban studies, discourse analysis, etc. He is the author of the book Urbicide, The Sense of Places Between Destructions and Reconstructions in Former Yugoslavia. Bologna 2010. Please proceed.
Thank you for this kind presentation. Here today, and yes, today I will talk about a small part of this research that we were mentioning that I conducted in 2008 and then published in 2010 in this book titled Urbicidio. This book it's a sort of re-edited version of my PhD thesis, and this describes the urban transformations of some cities of Western Balkans, important cities belonging to former Yugoslavian countries after the Yugoslav wars, after the collapse of Yugoslavia and after the birth of new nations. And in that research I analyze the changes in the processes of representation and auto-representation of identities, collective memories, of the images, to use the expression of Kevin Lynch, of those cities after the wars. In particular, I focused on the politics of reconstruction, analyzing how some important buildings damaged during the war were restored or not restored. So in my research I decided to study the post-war period of former Yugoslavia countries, but assuming this specific perspective, looking at cities and at the urban dimension and their transformation after the destruction of war, driven by the hypothesis that post-war moments of reconstruction constitute an opportunity to redesign the memoryscapes of wounded cities. And so, to start, why this restriction? Why the city? The first obvious reason is that cities are important places for the definition of individual and collective landscapes of memory, of course, and furthermore probably the prototypical space for the staging of the symbols of the collective memory. So looking at the evolution of the urban landscapes for me implied assuming a privileged perspective on the changes in the collective memory and identity. But secondly, probably even more important, because Yugoslav wars were somehow wars against cities, against urban culture. Indeed, many scholars coined, used specifically the concept of urbicide to describe this sort of anti-city character of Yugoslav wars. And I would like just to start from this notion of urbicide. It's probably many of you already heard about this term, describing a peculiar warfare addressed against either urban space and the values of urban culture themselves. We could define urbicide as a war strategy that aims to destroy the shared memories and identities represented by the materiality of urban environment. In other words, to erase the collective memory of the city. As many of you probably already know, it was Bogdan Bogdanovic, the important Yugoslav architect and former mayor of Belgrade, that was one of the first to talk of urbicide during Yugoslav wars. He defined it as the ritual murder of the cities. And according to Bogdanovic, in an herbicide war, the military targets are not determined by their strategic relevance. The target of every attack are instead the cultural landmarks and the cultural heritage and all the places with a high collective value. So, war against the city, it's also a war that aims to the destruction of collective memory embodied by the city. And the targets are hit for the symbolical relevance, for what they represent. But of course, we have many examples of cases of herbicide. I don't have time to talk about this here, but all of you know the case of Sarajevo. In particular, this siege map describes very well, if you look at the targets that were hit during the siege, all the symbolic landmarks of the city were hit during the shelling. Then Dubrovnik, Mostar, the city I'm going to talk about today. And but as I told you before, today I would like to focus more on what happened next. To the post-war period. Post-war period can be, in a way, intended as a sort of catastrophic moment as well. Catastrophic in the sense of the mathematician René Thom, of total reconfiguration of the system of values. And reconstruction that affects post-herbicide periods way be analyzed as spatial narrations, conveying also ideological effects. So I'm interested in post-herbicide, and I would like to focus particularly on one characteristic of murdered cities in post-war period, the presence of a lot of traces, of signs of destruction and war that can become signs of memory. Indeed, the main topic of my analysis regards just the semiotic processes of transformation of these traces that lead to different forms of spatialization of memory. As we are going to see in a few minutes, war has left in Mostar as well in the other cities I considered in my corpus or in my book, traces not only in the material surface of the urban landscape, but also in the collective consciousness and in the imaginary and in the semiotic identities of the cities. These war traces, in many cases, are still there. In other cases, were removed or transformed. But in a way, I would say that war was and continues, in a way, to be a strong stretch of identity of Mostar and many other cities of former Yugoslavia. And starting from this consideration, I try to study the changing in the public spaces of collective memory, looking mostly at these traces rather than at institutional memorials or monuments built expressly to remember. So I considered different practices of transformation of the spatial, in particular urban environment, that directly worked on these traces left by war in terms of preservation, erasure, modification, monumentalization, and so on. And the most important of these practices of transformation is, of course, architectonic reconstruction and restoration. And the common sense about architectonic restoration consider it a way to preserve memory, to conserve neutrally a past. But what I would like to point out today is that restoration and reconstruction, in as much as they deal with traces, converting them in signs of memory, history, or even oblivion, restoration is in fact a practice of rewriting of memory, reinvention of memory, as you said before. if we accept this point, we could have some problem with the idea of architectonic preservation, restoration intended as a critical and possibly neutral operation of preservation of memory. My hypothesis is rather extreme in this sense, because I think that restoration doesn't preserve, but rather invent a memory. It's a practice of rewriting that selects, handles, and transforms traces and their semantic values. So every restoration, even preservation, even simple preservation, operating on traces, translates a semiotics of remembrance, semiotics of memory, which inscribes peculiar values of temporality, peculiar modal forms of memory. For example, we must remember, we want to remember, we want to forget, we know how to remember, and so on. So, in a way, restoration transforms traces in tracks, in a chain of traces. I call them tracks, like a chain of traces, as spatial narrations that reinvent the memoryscapes of destroyed cities. And I think this is true in any case of restoration, but of course particularly in the case of post-war restoration. In any case, preservation is a manipulation of trace, like you said before. But the first thing that I would like to emphasize now, because it's also the central point of my argumentation, is that even as we saw Orbicide is a moment, Orbicide is aimed to produce oblivion, to erase memory. So it's a practice of dememorialization. On the contrary, we could think that post-Orbicide, the phase of reconstruction, it's a phase of rememorialization, of production of memory, while Orbicide was production oblivion. But at the same time, there is a sort of paradox that because Orbicide destroying produces also at the same time a memory of what happened under the forms of traces, of ruins, of remains of the war. While at the same time, the reconstruction, trying to restore the memory previously erased, produces also oblivion. Let's think about reconstruction that eliminate, erase ruins and traces of war. And this is just to make clear how many levels we have on the restoration, the post-war restoration, and the spatial narrations that are possible during restoration. So, before moving forward, I would like to stress an important point. Since now I distinguished between Orbicide and post-Orbicide like two temporal phases, two temporal moments. So Orbicide would be the ideological, political, strategical, organized violence against the cities, while post-Orbicide is a reconstruction that is also a semiotic refutation of the identity of the cities. But what I would like to stress that actually there isn't a clear temporal subsection, a clear temporal there are not two moments coming one after the other, but there is a sort of synchronicity of these different layers that interact in a way dialogue at the same time. The forms of reconstruction cannot skip the dialogue with the forms of destruction that come before during the war. And at the same time there is a sort of a continuous semiotic dialogue with all the layering of identities of the city before the war, even before the war. So this is just like an introduction, talking about the case studies that I choose for today, Mostar. The city of Mostar and the politics of reconstruction that were followed after the war, from this point of view, constitute, I think, a very interesting case study. I don't have time now today to talk about the history of the city, but probably many of you know that Mostar was one of the former Yugoslav cities that suffered the most, probably, the atrocities war during 90s. Mostar, along with Sarajevo and Vukovar, became a sort of symbols of the 90s war. It was first attacked by the Yugoslav army in the first phase of the war, and then was disputed when the Yugoslav army left the battlefield in 1992. It was disputed between the paramilitary forces of Croats, the HVO, and the paramilitary forces of Muslim or Bosniaks who were besieged in the old part of the city that was, as you know, of course, built during the Ottoman Empire, and was most famous landmark was the Stari Most, the beautiful old bridge built under Suleiman the Magnificent during the Ottoman Empire. So the historical Ottoman district was subjected to severe bombings by the Croats military forces and was almost razed to the ground. The destruction of the old bridge under the Croats grenade fire was probably one of the most traumatic events of the whole conflict, both for the Mostarians but also for the Western public opinion. And so it's not a surprise that after the war UNESCO promoted a project for the reconstruction of the old bridge as a sort of moral compensation for the terrible loss for what the international community itself didn't manage to avoid. Indeed, the bridge before the war was more than a simple landmark for the Mostarians. One could say that the bridge was a real symbiotic center of the city. Also, the name Mostar derived by most bridge in Serb-Croat. It was a meeting point, was a transgenerational monument with whom all the citizens of Yugoslavia, but probably it was also sort of universal in a way, monument recognized also outside the borders of Yugoslavia. It was also a symbol, of course, of multiculturalism, the core of the inter-ethnic cohabitation of this city, ever since the Ottoman period, when every religion was allowed and Bosniaks, Croats and Serbs lived together. And even under the socialist regime, Mostar had this greatest rate of citizens who declared themselves Yugoslav in the census, to testify this clear multiculturalism of the city of Mostar. And these are some pictures of the bridge before, during, and after, during the war, of course, when it was destroyed. And finally, in 2005, the bridge was restored as it was, where it was, to bring to mind this well-known wording of the stylistic restoration. Well-known, probably illusory in a way. It was of course, a state-of-the-art reconstruction, very careful from a philological point of view. But even if the restoration was greatly appreciated by many Mostarians, at least the Bosniaks one, that refused also other solution of reconstruction. But at the same time, in many interviews that I took during my fieldwork in Mostar, the most common expression about the bridge after a conversation was, well, you know, it's a fake, it's not the original one. And I started asking to myself what was the nature of about the concern about this bridge, this new old bridge, as the Mostarians call it, with a kind of irony. What was this concern about this character of being fake of the new old bridge? From a certain point of view, the bridge reconstruction reproduces the paradox of every in-style reconstruction, or every stylistic reconstruction, reconstructional identique, which, while trying to roll back the hands of time, forgets what has happened in the meantime. And probably this is the main problem of the new old bridge of Mostar, that is of course appreciated by the Mostarians, but at the same time perceived as a fake. It's not only a fake because it's a copy. the problem is not the natural gap which divides the original and the copy, but more specifically in this case, the fact that the new bridge hides something of the old one. That is to say, hide the destruction of the bridge. It's temporary and tragic absence. Nothing in the reconstruction talks about the destruction of the bridge. So nothing talks about this layer of this monument. If you look around yourself in the perfectly restored zone of the UNESCO, under the UNESCO protection and the UNESCO umbrella, if you are careful, you can find two symbols that are also two symptoms that something is going wrong in the rhetoric of UNESCO, asserting that the reconstruction of the bridge lead to an destruction of the fracture that divided the city during the war. The first sign is this small stone made of the same material as the bridge, the Tenelia stone, placed near the bridge, and let's say in English, so talking to the tourists, to the international community, the same international community that did intervene during the war, but only after to reconstruct the bridge. So don't forget, a very simple message. So near the restored bridge, the restored old bridge, in the reconstructed Kuyunziluk, in the reconstructed quarter of the Ottoman part of the city, this stone reestablishes the memory of the war and makes a denied memory come back, the memory which is not displayed in the UNESCO project. And it's a sort of reaction to the oblivion imposed by the reconstruction, a small spontaneous monument, probably for sure not planned in the original project. And to notice the second sign that something is going wrong, you have to raise your eyes and look towards the Hum Mountains that's close to the mountain of the city of Mostar, dominating the Mostar city center. There you will see this huge Catholic cross, 30 meters high. Nothing weird, one can say, nothing weird except for the fact that from that mountain during the war the Croat paramilitary force used to bomb the city. In a way, this cross impresses a sort of hierarchy on the balance of the semiotic forces fighting in Mostar today. So, it's interesting today is in the post-war Mostar, architecture becomes a symbolic language used to mark out a territory and to stage real semiotic battles inside the city. But to see this semiotic battle, we need to exit the UNESCO zone. That, by the way, is pretty recognizable, as you see in this picture, as a sort of closed space inside the city, a sort of protected space inside the city of Mostar. Only made for tourists in a way, for the tourist use and consumption. Outside the UNESCO borders of the city, we would immediately see that all the other reconstruction projects, also paid by the National Foundation and institution, have served following a sort of compensatory logic, aimed to refund each ethnic group, not only mosques, but only Catholic Bishop's Palace, the Orthodox Bishop Palace, and many other symbols. However, as a matter of fact, this choice had the results of a sort of crystallization of the ethnic divisions that are still operating in the city, maintaining in a way this two-side division producing during war, when the Croat besieger inhabited the western part of the city and they besieged the Bosniaks the eastern part of the city. And it's still possible to read today this internal division in the new architecture, not the one sponsored by UNESCO, of each part, such as this new mosque, similar to the new ones that you can find in Sarajevo, very stately, very huge, significantly different from the traditional design of the Bosnian mosque. At the same time, this new Catholic church that is built on the Croat side near this internal border. that was built on the rubble of this old church here that was bombed by Jena in 1992 and by the Yugoslav army. And the dimension and the material used also, this grey concrete, makes the church very similar to a bunker. Moreover, the very tall tower bell, 80 meters high, seems to be built to compete in the urban skyline with the numerous minarets of the historical city. The monuments also, for example, this monument here commemorating the war in the Croat side of the city that feeds the internal division and the Croat nationalism, celebrating the sacrifice of the Croat soldiers who died during the war. So the Croat soldiers that bombed the city are celebrated in Mostar by this monument. However, today you will find also in Mostar a lot of elements which, all these examples are very clear symbols that shows how architecture is used as a way to conduct a sort of semiotic war. But also you can find in the urban palimpsests of the city other elements which interfere. There is also the disappearing of the Serbs' identity with the erasure of the Orthodox Church that was destroyed during the war. And now there is a project of UNESCO to reconstruct him. There are some kind of practices, spontaneous practices of reappropriation of this space. But as I was telling before, there are also other elements which interfere with this context of conflicting architectonic narratives. We can call them a sort of symbolic reservoir which can activate other kinds of memory, the ones suppressed by the pacified UNESCO's narration. And for instance, the still present ruins that have an effect on bringing to life the memory of war that was cancelled by the restoration à l'identique of the bridge. There is also the partisan, the socialist memory that is still vivid in many monuments erected under Tito. Is still hardly questioned today, but when some people, mostly the older generation, would like to preserve this memory, there are also increasing acts of vandalism against these kind of monuments. In any case, all these different memories work out as narrative interferences against a sort of spontaneous memory, a sort of mémoire involontaire, Deleuze would have called it, that in part contradicts the mémoire volontaire of the institutional memory. And this doesn't regard only the policies of planning and construction, but also the urban practices as well. The many street graffiti, for example, testifies to what extent the streets of Mostar are a terrain of struggle between different nationalisms. All this practice of marking the territory of the city. And there is also room for narratives of resistance and opposition to the rhetoric of nationalism, as testified by this very strange monument which mysteriously appeared for a short time in Mostar. A statue of Bruce Lee, the famous actor and martial art expert. And this statue was placed by a group of activists as a sort of provocative symbol with the following writing. I don't know the writing here, but it's something like the statement made by one of the authors of this statue was, we have no more common symbols. Let's start finding the symbols that we share, because that we share during our childhood because of the movies and this kind of shared memories. And so the choice of Bruce Lee was obviously ironic, but not so much ironic. It was very popular in former Yugoslavia. It was a symbol of the past that everyone could share and understand in this moment, more than the oldest symbols. And the power of this semiotics experiment was proved by the fact that the statue was promptly vandalized by the nationalists of both sides, of Croat sides and Bosniak sides. And now it's removed, it's no longer there. And so the divisions within the city are legible, are visible through these conflicting spatial narratives expressed by different attitudes towards the traces of the past. So we have a lot of conflicting spatial narratives. The reconciliation narrative proposed by UNESCO that passes through oblivion, the Croat narrative, the Muslim narrative, also the war memory narrative, the socialist memory, the socialist narrative, and also different countercultural narratives. So all these different narratives intersect, overlap, interfere with each other. Narratives which do not compose, but rather clash among them. They are not in co-presence, but in competition. Not coexisting, but competing. But when I talk of urban practices, I mean also the way the city is used, is walked through by its citizens. And after we look at this mix of practices, architectonic marking and practice of territorialization, we clearly see the map of division inside the city today, that it's a map that in a way maintains the world geography of the city. I'm sorry, I beg your pardon here, it's in Italian because it's taken from my PhD thesis, this map. But this map are indicated all the main landmarks that I talked about earlier. And this map in a way duplicates the situation of the city during the war. We have the boulevard that is still the line, the border of division, the informal border of division inside the city, because Mostar today, there is no real border inside the city, there is no real boundary. Mostar is governed under a common administration. Nevertheless, the street which divided longitudinally the city into parts, that was the front line during the conflict, even today acts like a sort of semiotic border, dividing two different Mostar. Each Mostar has its own center, for example, Musala Square in the east part, the Rondeau in the western part. And they simply don't communicate with each other. And in a way, the evolution of this front line in a sort of invisible border line, it's clearly visible today if you take a walk in this part of the city. So. The most important place of the city today, it's not the new old bridge, but the boulevard, the former front line that today is in this condition. It's a clear border in a way, with closings and openings. Some part of this border are more closed than the other. For example, this is, you can see on the left, top left, the border near the Catholic Church that I showed you before. And here, actually, the boulevard works as a border because there is a wall, it's the wall of the parking, that's also a wall that closes all the communication between two parts. There is a mosque on the other side, on the Croat side, that is completely closed. You cannot go inside the mosque. And you see signs of war everywhere in this part of the city. There is also a cross here planned to mark the territory as we are here. And there are also some part of the boulevard that are more open, that constitutes a sort of opening. For example, Spansky Trg. Spansky Square is a sort of still a place of exchange and it's not a place, it's a sort of no man's land, to be honest, because of course, it's a part that cannot be avoided for people living in Mostar, but it's a strategic part of the boulevard because it appears like a sort of open fringe zone in this kind of internal border. It's not an actual border, but it's actually in the mind of people living there. And if we compare the situation today, the situation of this map here, with the pre-war situation, where the Spassky Square was the center of the social life of the city, we see how the strategic point for the politics of reconstruction should be placed there, more than the Stary Old Bridge, the Novi Stary Most. So to conclude, and also you were talking before about the supposed universal value of UNESCO heritage. In this case, I think. It's interesting to pose to raise the same question you raised, because in this, of course, this is a very different case of post-war reconstruction. But today there is also this kind of idea that reconstruction and heritage management can be used as a sort of tool for soft diplomacy and to foster the dialogue. That is always, of course, it's true. But it's true when we start from an analysis of the real situation of the internal situation of the city. The restoration of the old bridge was important because of the role, the artistic value, the cultural value of the bridge in itself. But the lack of politics of reconstruction in the rest of the city, in a way, constituted, I know it's kind of extreme here, but constituted a way to prosecute the herbicide by other means, in a way. And so we should, I think, consider also this in the heritage management, that sometimes heritage reconstruction in this kind of situation can constitute, to paraphrase Clausewitz, prosecution of war by other means. And so that's all. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, the three of you. It was extremely interesting. And I'll ask the audience if there are any questions. Have you? Now or what?
Yes, yeah.
I myself have some questions later.
Okay, I had only the last speaker, unfortunately, so I would like to ask something about his very, very nice presentation. I really like the way you presented the Mostar case. I have two questions related to, let's say, the preconditions of your presentation. First of all, the question that came to my mind is, why urban? Why just urban space? You talked about the urban space, okay? And I was thinking the Bosnian case, and I was thinking about the countryside, the villages. You see exactly the same things, I think, in the villages, but in a smaller scale, of course. So why the urban space is different than any other living space? This is my first question, okay? And the second has to do with what you said, restoration as a practice of rewriting memory. That invents memory. I'm thinking of many other things, many other history that invents memory, not just restoration. And my question is, if through this case you see, is it just an exemplar case of the theory that says that memory is invented by many practices, restoration is one of them, or it changes? Can that case say something about the history, the theory, or is it just an example of the theory? Athens.
Can I answer now, or we collect
Well, maybe we can collect some more questions if there are any, and proceed to the lines. Yeah.
I would speak to the last presentation as well, because I also kind of many overlapping points in my case. But I just want to ask you one thing at the end, considering the reactions not only to the Bruce Lee monument, but reactions on everyday level. You mentioned in the beginning traces and trails and all that. Is there, do you observe a movement of people to some joint shared spaces? Is there some space? You mentioned something about this at the end, so could you like to expand about it a little bit?
Again, to question for last weekend. Following up on the first question, what is it exactly that you think you get by studying this material through the prism of semiotics? And I'm asking this because you haven't, for instance, referred to particular language-derived analytic models or tools, like you haven't used like Anthropology or metonymies or different conceptual tools that semiotic analysis. So what about if we just instead of change the words and instead of signs use another word, and instead of think of symbols or think of traces, and what is it exactly that your semiotic analysis does here? What is the difference that it makes?
Any other question from Fran? Yes? Okay.
Can I start answering? Yeah.
Take this because
So
it's...
why the urban environment? Because my initial idea was to study the processes of changing, of transformation in the collective memory of former Yugoslavia countries. And I think that especially capital cities are I call them the prototypical space for the staging of official memories. And so this is why. But your question is very interesting because there is a big debate raised by Bogdanovic again. Bogdan, he distinguished between urban culture. This urbanized theory is based on this contraposition between city and country, city and countryside. The city is the place of the urban values, of the urban culture, of the multiculturalism, while the countryside is the monocultural, the nationalistic culture rises in countryside, according to Bogdanovic. And I think that you're right, it is a sort of oversimplification. There is, of course, something like this, especially in former Yugoslavia, I think, especially in Bosnia. There is a main difference between Sarajevo, that was the big city for all the Bosniaks, and the villages. This is more true in Western Balkans than in many other places, I think. Also in Italy there are big differences between big cities and villages, but villages have a sort of urban dimension in themselves. But this is a bad, you're right, because that was a bad legacy of the Bogdanovic interpretation, because in a way many research were focused only on cities, and we just forgot about a lot of massacres, of bad things that happened outside the media focus of that was all put on the cities. And so I'm explaining you why I choose the urban, because of the symbolic relevance of the city itself. But sometimes there is this risk. You're right. So history, I'm a semiotician, so I think that I'm a constructionist. And when the first time I approached architectonic restoration from a semiotic point of view, I was comparing restoration to the other practices of codification of the past, as philology, as a history as well. of course, this is a very, just to oversimplify the question, it's very more tricky than that. But there is also, I think, a big difference between memory and history. I'm talking here of memory, and memory is mostly narration. And sometimes there isn't a clear overlapping between history and memory. So I'm a constructionist also when I think about the historical discourse, but not as constructionist as here. I know that history is different because it's a scientific discipline with some rules and so on. I hope that I answered to your question. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, the second answer was not so clear to me, but...
You were asking what if my position include also an attitude toward, for example, history, as if I'm constructionist toward history.
If invention of memory through restoration has some difference from any other kind of invention of memory?
There are some differences and some points in common, of course. The point in common is the narrative form. I think that also history works with the narrative form, even when denied the narrative forms. History is narration. I think that space is narration as well. So this is, there are of course other differences that. You were asking, Goran, if there are other. Yeah, I took the example of Bruce Lee because it's that's the most vivid example. But actually, yeah, there is the frame is very complex. There are a lot of narratives clashing each other, and there is also counter narrative. There is the Abrashevich association, for example. They do a lot of interesting things. Anti-nationalist just to fight this nationalist rhetoric that is very strong in Mostar, because the Croat side, they are even more nationalist than the real Croats, as always happen in border zones. And so yes, there are a lot of examples. The methodology here now I use semiotics is my discipline, so I had a lot of problem with this research because especially in Bologna we have a very strict methodology, very textual methodology. Instead I propose a very contaminated methodology made by textual semiotics inspired by the works of Gray Mass, for example, especially the semiotics of culture of Yuri Lotman and Umberto Eco as well, but also contaminated with ethnography, with cultural geography, with history also, with and so here I'm using the word. I avoided any kind of meta language because we tend to be very boring when we use in semiotics when we use our meta language, and so here I used the word semiotic only as an adjective, only something to qualify. Something like, yes, can be here semiotic be changed with symbolic, but the difference for me is that with symbol I mean something different, something more codified, and something that is that has always an intention, while with semiotic intend not only the communication process but also the signification process, something that signifies because can be interpreted in many ways. So it's okay. Okay. Yeah.
Question for the other two, for Tijana Rakic or for Chavdar Marinov? I have question. Athina Skoulariki.
I wanted to congratulate all because it was really interesting, and I think that the three interventions were converging in many ways, and I think the whole, the whole conference will be produce a dialogue that is very interesting and very currently very important in the Balkans. And I want to ask about the Acropolis story. I mean, we have a discussion over the break, and I was thinking more, about it. I found very interesting what you did, of course, and what your conclusions were. My only problem was the final conclusion that you raised. process of UNESCO, is successful or not. And I think that this project was, as we said, was supposed to protect the monuments and not to label them so much. The label is because the idea is that an international organization would guarantee the protection, which is not always the case. And they are of world importance because they contributed in a history of culture and the history of architecture and the history of mentality and intellect and whatever, but it doesn't mean that the monuments don't have, that they're not located in space and time. Now, the Acropolis is a very specific example together maybe with the pyramids, because they indeed had a very global influence over the centuries. So you can discuss this kind of identification there. Otherwise, putting any kind of national identity on any monument is arbitrary, of course. Because it was made in a specific time under a specific civilization. But at the same time, there are monuments, for example, that are protected by UNESCO, as for example, the fortress of Tombouctou. Okay, it's a masterpiece in my opinion. It's beautiful and it should be protected. And right now there's a war, and it was in danger and everything. But this monument, you cannot say that other cultures are identified with, because until I've seen it in TV, I have never seen it. So it doesn't mean that all of these monuments are having a worldwide influence. It means, and the opposite, that the world today tries to conserve them because they influence a specific culture, and it's very important as far as it would be better to protect any monument, but okay. So what I want to say is that I'm not sure that the idea of universalism is meant to be in this way. Of course, the story, we also talked about the fact that tourism and marketing today are labeling monuments and trying to put a brand, and to construct the brand of Greece or the brand of Turkey and the brand of France, labeling monuments as national. And we are oversimplifying their influence, their impact, their identity, or whatever. So, but I don't think that you could really question the fact that there is a need or that the project of UNESCO is successful or not based on this.
Thank you. Very interesting. As we discussed, my intention here was not to criticize the project of protecting, identifying very important heritage sites throughout the world. My critique here is to the core of the concept of World Heritage, where UNESCO itself, the World Heritage Committee, claimed that these places need to be seen as belonging to and representing all the identities of all the cultures of the whole world. And it is there where I try to explore this further and see whether this can be possible in practice. There were other scholars who criticized this idea of UNESCO. Gregory Ashford, for example, a cultural geographer from Netherlands, also questioned this idea of trying to create a world category of heritage in a time when many monuments are given this national label, because inheriting the national by labeling them as world heritage, then you're trying to disinherit from the national context, and there will of course be tensions there. And this is what intrigued me in this research. I wanted to see what happens in practice, given that many of these places are tourist attractions, given that many of these places have many different meanings through their history. The Acropolis had other histories behind it, not only the classical period. I was really intrigued to see whether and how this does it really function in practice, and what happens in the contemporary times. How do people who visit these places like the Acropolis, how do they perceive it? How do these millions of people that visit the Acropolis annually, how do they see the Acropolis? Do they feel that it's a part of their personal and collective identity, or do they see it as more of a symbol of the Greek nation? And this is, in my mind at least, was something different to the project of restoration, preservation, etc. I hope this answers your question.
I have one question for both. Chaglad's paper and your paper, Tirana. I'm wondering whether you ask yourself some questions or you have any ideas about whether the producers of these narratives or of those symbols, reconfigured symbols of heritage, had an audience in mind. Did they have an idea of whom were they aiming at? What are the tourists? Because tourism, for example, in your Acropolis example, as you mentioned, is not something that is stable, right? It changes over time, so you don't really have any. You cannot say there's a habitus of tourism for Acropolis or a habitus of tourism of Melnik or that image. So have you thought about the receiving side, from the side of the producers? Do they think about what their target is, or is it, do you think it's something that is completely closed to that idea when in the process of building this construction?
Would you like me?
If you, or maybe I can start.
Yes, offer my view.
Yeah, well, at least in my case, there is an interaction between different projects. In fact, different, how to say, not different projects, but different groups of people who promoted this heritage. So we have the architects and restorers. We have the historians, and we have also the practically the party state clerks during the socialist period. And these different groups actually their activity converged in a way. First, everything, well, at least in the case of Melnik, started with this search for national architecture. In the case of the architects during the interwar period, especially already before the First World War, before the Balkan Wars, but especially in the interwar period. After that, we have also the historians who try to fight the thesis of other neighboring historians, namely the Greek specialists. And finally, we have the patriotic interest of the extremely nationalist communist regime, especially since the 60s. And they really consider this as, well, they have, of course, different ideas about the target group. It changed over time. Finally, what we see is that the idea was really to educate the masses, so to say, in a patriotic spirit, especially since the 60s on. It is quite visible, and the state organizes all kinds of festivities, festivals in Melnik with slogans like medieval Bulgarian stronghold, etc., stronghold of Bulgarians, things like that. So I'm not sure if my reply is exactly to the point, but briefly, the ideas changed over time. The idea of the target group also changed. The idea of the purpose, overall purpose, changed. But finally, the different strategies converged in a way.
And The answer is relatively similar in my case, with the difference being that I looked only at materials produced in the context of tourism. So the guidebooks were produced for the visitors, for tourists, whether they were locals or international. Similar applies to postcards and promotional campaigns. But what I have seen is that, of course, these things change over time, because we have seen, for example, in the brief analysis of the postcards that I've shown, that the Acropolis was represented very differently in the late 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, and very different. It's represented very differently today, and probably 100 years from now, we will see very different representations of it in various forms of tourist materials. But what I think is that those reflected both the ideas of symbols of the local identity on a local level, and those that were trying to be conveyed to the wider public or the international visitors. So in a sense, we have what we talked about during the break, a simplified representation of the nation through the symbols like heritage sites. But at the same time, this is reinforcing a local sense of identity. So it has a double fluid function.
Thank you.
Can I ask a small question to Sandra? Now with the tourism, and especially the tourism that comes from Greece, don't they try to relabel this village to say to attract the Greeks, for example? Because in Turkey they are doing that. Like, come to the old Greek village to see and welcome and blah, blah, blah. They don't have.
Actually, it's rather you that who can tell me if this exists, because I do not have.
May I answer?
Yeah, if you can answer, because I do not have this impression. It is not like something like the Beyoğlu revival of Greek memory.
I don't want to.
But please tell me.
I am a tourist in Melnik. I was greatly curious about what you are asking. So, as a tourist in Melnik, I didn't see any of the sort, and in fact, there's nothing whatsoever. Nothing, because Melnik is not a known part of the Greek heritage whatsoever, because there is no reciprocity with Bulgaria. There is a kind of memory about what we say in Greece, Eastern Rumelia, and the Greek communities of the Black Sea, what is called Philippoupolis, and what is called Stenimachos, and very few things about Melnik, because there is something about the memory of Melnik which links it to Kilkis and the Second Balkan War. And so even the people from Melnik in Sidirokastro and Salonika and all over Greece didn't ever want to promote the memory of the city itself, because there is a fundamental lie in the way it was abandoned in August 1913 by its inhabitants. It was said in the illustration you saw, Chavdar showed you, it was said that it was burned by its inhabitants, who on the hills saw their ancient Byzantine town weeping because they had to burn it, because it was given to the Bulgarians after the Treaty of Bucharest, and they were weeping because they were leaving their ancient town, so they had to leave and they had to burn it in order not to give it to the enemy, as the Serbs did in the suburb of Ilica in Sarajevo. So something like that, which they were also supposed to have done in Strumica, which was not true. It was the army who burned the Greek quarters. So they came in and they settled, the community settled in Demir Hisar, but in fact they were meant to be settled in the ruins of the burned Kilkis, Kukush. So there was some kind of controversy. So they maintained the memory of the town, but they never, in fact, tried to revive this memory. So it was there was no territorialization of the memory. So Greeks who go to Melnik, they go thinking it's a Bulgarian town. There is no, it's something out of time and space. Melnik is not on the map. So the Greeks who go there go for the good wine without knowing that it is a Greek tradition of wine. Not that the Bulgarians don't do a very good wine, but they don't know that the Melnik wine is meant to be the continuation of the ancient wine, which is not. It's a new kind of wine, which is very good, but which is a new kind of wine. So you see, there is nothing of the sort. If I answered your question, if it fits your, if it fits your.
Thank you, Leonidas. Yeah, absolutely.
Maybe I can ask one question to you.
Yeah, and we.
Or is there's no time. It was my.
Maybe just a final short.
No. So no. If there's no time, we stop.
Well.
3 minutes.
Yeah.
3 minutes.
Yeah.
So I have one question I wanted to ask you.
Yes, of course.
Or maybe as a discussion that I don't have the right to ask you.
Yes.
I have.
Yes. We have, of course. Yes.
So I do.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I wanted to ask you if there's, if you know, because that's we have very parallel subjects when you are talking about Melnik, and I did my research on the town of Kukush, Kilkis. There's something I want to ask you. You know that the extreme opposite the opposite of Melnik is in Greece is the town of Kilkis and its region, which was burned in the Second Balkan War. And there's a problem because the monuments there. It's something I would like to discuss in general. Is that it's the only Greek nomos department which. In French sense department, county, which has no monuments whatsoever. And it's a very interesting thing there because the town of Kilkis was burned. It was a picturesque stone town. It was mostly the great majority of the population was Slav-speaking Bulgarians at the time, Exarchists. And the only ancient building of kind of interest that still stands is on the hill. It's the Church of St. George, as you know. And it's presented as a Greek monastery, which was not. It was an Exarchist church, and it was not a monastery. And there's no other monument whatsoever. The only it's only the tourist guide of Kilkis. It's only sports activities and mountains and the flora of the region and all this from the eastern side of Kilkis. And the only churches that are very interesting, but they are of the time of what the Bulgarians call the paintings inside, the time of revival, are completely. The Greek Ephoria Neoteron Mimion has put a fence and they're in ruins because they are written in Greek letters, please, but in Greek letters, but in Slav speak, in Slav language. So you see it's written Decembria 18, which is the Slavonic genitive of Decembriu 18. Which was the inauguration date of the church. So I ask you, are there examples of a complete evacuation of Greek script, which was a problem of the Bulgarian national attitude towards Greek? The Macedonians don't have this problem because they know that if there's no obliteration of the Greek script on the Republic of Macedonia, say, there's no obliteration of the Greek script in Macedonia. But in Bulgaria, there is a problem of the Greek script. So the problem in Kukush is the obliteration question of the monuments itself, so no monuments in the region of Kilkis. In Melnik, which is a great problem, and in the other towns you have seen, is there a problem of the numerous Greek scripts on the popular paintings or the churches?
Yes, of course. But well, it is maybe not the case in Melnik, where we have the old metropolitan church, which is still there, and the monastery of Rosino, where the Greek script is preserved, I believe, from what I remember. But for instance, if you go to Filipopouli, to Plovdiv, the Greek script is most of the cases removed, and it is covered with Slavic, with Cyrillic, especially in Agia Marina, in Plovdiv, etc. Actually, in many cases, you can see also beneath, you can see the Greek inscriptions and how they are covered with Church Slavonic. And this is actually something that began already in the 19th century. With the so-called revival movement. So, yes, of course. This is...
And is it something that was continued during the communist authorities, during the communist era by the authorities?
I believe, I'm not sure. I'm not sure, but certainly in the interwar period this was the case. After the Second World War, I don't know, frankly speaking. Because you already have, since the 50s, the Institute for the Protection of Monuments, with the new policy of rather, I don't know if it was still done after the Second World War. Yeah, maybe we can.
Thank you.
Thank you for the question. And well, thank you all. So we are going to continue in something like 2 hours.
3:30? 4:45.
3:45. Thank you.